Welcome to Whispers, Secrets, and Wounds. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe to the channel. Like this video, it really helps the channel grow. Share it with someone who might enjoy it too. Comment your location. We'd love to know where you're watching from.
James looked at himself in the mirror, carefully adjusting his tie. He knew this wasn't just an ordinary party, it was his wife Emily's company party, and he would finally have the chance to see up close the environment where she spent so many hours of her day. Since she started this new job, something had changed. She always seemed to be involved in more meetings, dinners with colleagues, and appeared to be gradually distancing herself from the life they shared at home. James hadn't mentioned this before. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe it was just the fast pace of work. As they descended the building stairs, Emily was stunning, dressed in an elegant red dress. She carried a smile that seemed nervous, which James found strange. "It's normal to be a little anxious. You don't go to many work parties with me," she commented, trying to break the silence that had formed between them. He gave a soft smile in response, but his stomach was already starting to churn with unease. The party was held in a luxurious hotel in Chicago. The bright lights, refined decor, and ambient music created a welcoming yet imposing atmosphere. As soon as they arrived, Emily was greeted with warm hugs and animated greetings from her colleagues. James felt out of place for a moment, knowing no one besides his wife. She introduced him to some co-workers, and they exchanged a few cordial words, but he couldn't help noticing how she always seemed attentive to something, or someone, on the other side of the room. As they mingled among the guests, James noticed Emily's boss, Richard, a middle-aged man with a confident and charismatic demeanor. He recognized him from photos and stories Emily had mentioned from time to time, always with admiration. What he didn't expect was the familiarity between them. Richard approached, greeting Emily with a broad smile, and they began conversing as if they were old friends. James, standing beside them, felt almost invisible as they exchanged laughs and inside jokes. Something didn't seem right, but he tried to push the thought away. After all, it was just a party. While Emily and Richard continued their conversation, James watched out of the corner of his eye, trying to convince himself it was just part of the work dynamic, nothing more. But the easy laughter, the glances, the way they moved in the space as if they were alone, all of it created an uncomfortable feeling deep in his mind. He didn't know if it was fatigue or sudden paranoia, but the night that began with anticipation was starting to take a different turn than he had imagined. Trying to compose himself, James grabbed a glass of wine and walked around the party, observing everything around him. The soft music filled the room while the laughter and conversations of the other guests echoed through the hall. He forced a smile whenever someone greeted him, but his mind was distant, focused on the interaction he had just witnessed between Emily and Richard. Something didn't fit. As much as he tried to rationalize, the intimacy they displayed was unsettling. From where he stood, James could see Emily from afar, laughing at something Richard had said, the way she tilted her head to listen better, how she lightly touched his arm while they talked. They were subtle gestures, but enough to make his stomach churn. Richard, in turn, seemed completely at ease, as if that closeness was the most natural thing in the world. James wondered how long this had been happening, and more importantly, why he hadn't noticed before. At one point, Richard made a joke, the kind only someone very familiar could understand, and Emily let out a loud laugh, drawing the attention of some colleagues. James, standing beside them, felt like an intruder. They moved in sync, as if they had practiced that dance of glances and smiles for a long time. It was impossible to ignore the growing discomfort settling inside him. Why had she never talked about Richard at home like this? Why was he discovering this version of Emily only now, in that environment? James tried to distract himself, but his mind kept returning to the two of them. He looked around the party, searching for something to take his attention away, but it seemed all paths led him back to the same place, the way Emily and Richard behaved together. As the night progressed, James began to realize he was the only one who didn't see this as normal. The other guests seemed indifferent, perhaps accustomed to this dynamic, but for him, everything was new and unsettling. The noise around the party began to seem distant, almost muffled. James felt a kind of emptiness growing inside him. It wasn't just the closeness that bothered him, it was the fact that he had never seen that part of Emily's life. The hours she spent at work, the meetings, the outings after work, all of it seemed to have more layers than he had imagined. He felt like a stranger, someone being introduced to his own wife for the first time. Even so, James tried to convince himself he was exaggerating, that it was just his insecurity speaking louder. Maybe it was the drink, or maybe the fact that he had never attended these events before. He tried to rationalize, but the complicit smiles between Emily and Richard continued to echo in his mind. Every time he looked at them, it was as if the environment closed in. He could no longer see the other guests, no longer hear the music. All he saw was that uncomfortable closeness, those gestures and laughs that seemed to belong to a world he did not. Then, as he watched Emily and Richard once again, something inside James changed. He couldn't quite explain it, but it was as if a curtain had been lifted. The doubt gnawing at him began to solidify into certainties, small fragments of a truth he wasn't yet ready to face but was already taking shape within him. The weight of these certainties began to accumulate in James's chest, but he still fought against them, as if he could somehow ignore what his eyes were seeing. He stood up from the table, taking a long sip of wine, trying to calm his nerves. He needed to step away, to clear his mind and maybe realize he was making up stories in his head. "I'm going to the bathroom," he muttered to himself, as if that were the only reason to leave. He passed by some of Emily's colleagues, who greeted him briefly, but their words were distant murmurs. His only focus was to distance himself from the party. Walking through the corridors, the hotel walls seemed narrow, and the sound of the party behind him slowly faded, as if he were leaving it behind not just physically but emotionally. With each step, he felt himself moving away from a reality he no longer wanted to face. Upon leaving the bathroom, James took a deep breath. Maybe when he returned, he could see everything differently. Maybe the perspective he needed was simply to step away for a few minutes. He shook his head, trying to expel the troubling thoughts, but as he turned to return to the party, something made him stop. On the opposite side of the hall, in a more isolated area, he saw Emily again, only this time, she wasn't conversing with any other colleague. She was there with Richard, in a conversation that seemed much more intimate than anything James had witnessed that night. Their words were low whispered. They were far enough that no one from the party could see them, no one except James. For a moment, he hesitated. His first impulse was to turn away, to avoid seeing what was happening. Maybe he didn't really want to know. Maybe it was better to pretend he hadn't seen anything, return to the party, and continue the night as if everything was normal. But something inside him, a force he couldn't control, compelled him to keep watching. Then it happened. In the middle of the conversation, Richard leaned closer to Emily. James barely had time to process what he was about to see. Richard tilted his head and without hesitation, planted a quick kiss on his wife's lips, a furtive kiss but full of meaning. It wasn't long or passionate, but enough to make James's heart stop for a moment. The ground seemed to crumble beneath his feet. He blinked several times, hoping his eyes had deceived him, but no, what he saw was real. What he had been suspecting all night was now laid bare before him. The weight of betrayal, which had previously been just a shadow in his mind, now hit him like a punch to the stomach. His lungs seemed unable to breathe, and the wine he had drunk rose back to his throat with a bitter taste. But he couldn't react, not there, not at that moment. If there was one thing James knew, it was that he needed to stay calm. It wasn't time for confrontations. His body became paralyzed, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, but his expression remained cold. With one last look, he slowly moved away from the corridor, without Emily or Richard noticing his presence. As he returned to the hall, James felt empty. The sound of the party, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all now seemed distant and irrelevant. He was no longer part of that world. Whatever had been built between him and Emily over the years now seemed to silently crumble without anyone else knowing what was happening. Sitting back at the table, James said nothing. The party continued around him, but he was no longer part of the celebration. Inside him, something had changed forever. The image of Emily and Richard, so close and intimate, was now engraved in his mind, and he knew that nothing would be the same from that moment on. Back at the party, James moved automatically. His body was present, but his mind wandered to a distant place, fixated on the image he had just witnessed. Every detail of the kiss between Emily and Richard replayed in his head like a movie he couldn't stop watching. The hall was full of people, but for him, it was as if everything was silent. Emily returned to the table shortly after, radiant as if nothing had happened. She kissed him on the cheek, asking if he was okay, if he needed another drink. James, expressionless, just nodded, trying to respond with neutrality. His mind, however, was in conflict. Part of him wanted to scream, confront her right there in front of everyone, ask what was happening, why she had crossed that line. But another part, the colder and more rational one, knew it would be pointless to do that there. He needed time, needed to think and above all, understand what that betrayal meant to him, to their marriage, to the future. The wine glass in front of him seemed not to diminish no matter how many sips he took. The taste no longer mattered. His throat was dry, and his hands, once steady, now trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that he needed to hold them in his lap, hiding the agitation. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. James could see Emily interacting with her colleagues, laughing, talking about the night's success. She was the perfect image of the dedicated wife, involved with her work, but for James, that now felt like a painful lie. As Emily and Richard continued their interactions, each smile exchanged between them felt like a blow. And not just because of the kiss, James now saw everything through a new lens. He began to realize that the small gestures, the discreet glances, the jokes only they understood, all were part of something much bigger that he still didn't know the extent of. He wondered how long they had been in that relationship, whether it was just recent or if he had been deceived for months, even years. The truth, however, hit him with a crushing weight. It no longer mattered. He felt that at that moment, something inside him had changed irrevocably. It wasn't just the act of betrayal itself, it was the trust that had been broken, the complicity he thought existed between them, now forever tainted. He realized, as he looked at Emily, that this would be his last night as her husband. This was a decision he had already made in silence, without needing big explosions or confronting her there and then. The silence between them in the car on the way home would be just the reflection of a marriage that had ended at that party. The moment James saw what he could no longer ignore. The betrayal was not just a kiss. It was the accumulation of gestures, moments, things unsaid that had been revealed that night under the lights of that party, which, ironically, seemed like a celebration but for him was the end of everything. The wine, the laughter, the smiles between her and Richard, James now saw it all completely. The pieces of the puzzle he had ignored for so long finally fit together. He realized that the silence he maintained now was not just the refusal to confront reality, it was the acceptance that he already knew what would come after that night. When the party finally ended, James and Emily left the hall together, but the silence between them was almost palpable. The sound of their steps echoed in the hotel's lobby, and as much as Emily tried to start casual conversation, James could only respond with monosyllables. With each word from her, he felt a pang in his chest, as if she were speaking of a reality that no longer belonged to him. The walk to the car was brief, but for James, it seemed like an eternity. He could hear the sound of their own breathing mixed with the car's engine roaring to life, but the emotional silence between them was deafening. During the drive back, the city lights passed by the window, creating reflections of a night that, to anyone else, might seem ordinary. For James, however, each light that illuminated his face reflected the darkness he felt inside. He looked at the busy streets, the unknown faces of people passing by without knowing the turmoil unfolding inside the car. The steering wheel firm in his hands was the only point of contact with reality. He drove on autopilot, without really thinking about the destination. The only thing he knew clearly was that this night would be his last as Emily's husband. Emily, sitting beside him, continued to try to maintain a light conversation. She commented on the party, the colleagues, the event's success. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she were living in a world where the betrayal James had witnessed didn't exist. But for him, each word from her was a cruel reminder of the lie that now permeated everything between them. He wondered how she could act so naturally after everything that had happened that night. Maybe it was habit. Maybe she was so accustomed to living that facade that she didn't even realize the veil had fallen. Or maybe, he thought, she simply didn't imagine that he knew. The drive back home was dominated by this growing silence, a silence that spoke more than any discussion or confrontation could. It was the silence of the end, an end that, at that moment, only James understood. He didn't need answers. He didn't need explanations. Everything was already clear. The betrayal to him was not just the kiss he witnessed, but all the moments when he had trusted blindly, all the time she had disguised, smiling at him while the truth was hidden in plain sight. Arriving home, Emily got out of the car, still oblivious to what was going on in James's mind. He watched her as she walked toward the front door, as if it were just another day, another night like any other. James turned off the car's engine and remained seated for a moment, looking at the house where so many memories had been built. It was strange to think that all of that, the home they shared, the moments of intimacy, the conversations, the promises, now seemed distant, as if belonging to another life. A life that, for him, had ended at that party. Entering the house, he realized how every detail seemed the same, but at the same time, everything had changed. The furniture, the photos on the wall, the familiar smell of home, all remained, but inside him, nothing held the same meaning anymore. Emily went upstairs, still talking about how tired she was and how she could hardly wait to lie down. James followed her in silence, each step heavier than the last. Upon reaching the bedroom, he watched Emily getting ready for bed, still carefree, still living the illusion that the next day would be like any other. For her, maybe it would be. But for James, this was the last night. He looked at her lying in bed, eyes already closed, and realized that their marriage, in fact, had ended long before that night. The betrayal was just the trigger, the final point of a story that had been silently unraveling for a long time. That night, James laid down next to Emily, but the abyss between them was insurmountable. There was nothing more to be said. The words that could have resolved conflicts, the conversations that might have saved the relationship, all now seemed irrelevant. Silence settled definitively, not as a pause, but as an end. He knew that at dawn, the decision would be made. As the minutes dragged on that last night, James stayed awake, looking at the ceiling, with the soft sound of Emily's breathing beside him. She slept deeply, unaware that when she woke up, the man beside her would no longer be the husband she thought she knew. That morning, when the sun was just starting to peek through the gaps in the curtain, Emily woke up slowly, still feeling enveloped in the calm of a peaceful night. But upon opening her eyes, something seemed different. The bed beside her was unmade, but James wasn't there. Her eyes wandered around the room, and then she saw the suitcases, 2 large suitcases, carefully placed next to the door. Her heart raced instantly, a sudden chill running up her spine. Before she could fully process what was happening, James entered the room with a serene but cold expression she had never seen before. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. He stood there, just looking at her. The silence between them was dense, loaded with a tension that Emily couldn't understand, or didn't want to understand. "James, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, crossed his arms, and finally, with a calm and direct voice, said, "I saw you, Emily. You and Richard. Near the bathroom. I saw the kiss." Emily froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and the blood seemed to drain from her face. For a moment, she was speechless, trying to assimilate what he had said. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come out immediately. "James, no, you're misunderstanding. It was just a conversation. It was nothing, I swear. I love you." She got up from the bed quickly, walking toward him, almost desperate. "It was just a moment. I don't even know why. It was a mistake." He looked at her impassive, as if her words were small, desperate attempts to extinguish a fire that had already consumed everything. James was no longer angry. He had gone through that phase the previous night. Now, there was only certainty. "Emily, this wasn't just a moment. It was a choice. You chose to betray my trust, and more than that, you undid everything we built. It's no use trying to explain now. But we're married. We have a life together, James. This can't end because of a mistake." Emily's voice was full of pleading but also disbelief, as if she still couldn't accept what was happening. James looked into her eyes and with a firmness almost painful said, "Emily, when we got married, I already had this house. I already had the money we have in the bank. You accepted the conditions and agreed to that. The house is mine. The money is mine. Please, take your things and leave." She was stunned, as if the world was collapsing around her. Her hands trembled. You can't be serious," she murmured, her voice shaking. But James didn't back down. "I'm very serious. I want you to leave. Now." Emily looked at the suitcases, her face pale, as if she couldn't believe this was really happening. She opened her mouth to protest once more, but the words died before being spoken. She knew it was useless. She muttered a few low words, still in shock, and slowly walked to the suitcases. She grabbed the handles with trembling hands, struggling to hold back tears, and left the room without looking at him. James heard her steps descending the stairs, the front door opening, and the distant sound of her car leaving. He stood there for a long time, until the silence of the empty house was all that remained. Weeks passed. The divorce was underway, and finally, The day came when they would meet to sign the papers. The meeting was in a cold, formal office. Emily was visibly worn out, but tried to maintain her composure. James, on the other hand, was serene, as if he had made peace with what had happened. Before signing, Emily, almost as a last gesture of pride, said, "Richard rented an apartment for me. I'm fine. I don't need anything from you." James just nodded slightly, without saying anything. He already knew. There was nothing more to be said between them. They signed the papers in silence, and in the end, she left without looking back. Months later, James received news that made him pause for a moment, more out of surprise than anything else. Richard, Emily's boss, was married. And when his wife discovered the affair, he refused to stay with Emily. She insisted, pressured him, and instead of taking responsibility for the relationship, he simply fired her. Emily, who had clung to Richard as her lifeline, was now alone. James, on the other hand, moved on. He sold the house where so many memories had been built and destroyed and moved to another city. He found peace in that new life, away from bitter memories and silent betrayals. He didn't regret anything. He knew that, despite the pain, he had done what was right. Now he could finally move forward, free from a past that no longer defined him. Thank you for being a part of this story with me. If it moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Whispers, Secrets and Wounds stories. We noticed many of you who enjoy these stories aren't subscribed yet. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're becoming part of a community that values deep, meaningful storytelling. Let's continue exploring these heartfelt journeys together. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story.